The Dakota wind carries whispers tales of grit gold and gunpowder, but some stories are etched not in stone, but in the scar tissue of a broken heart. This is the story of Elara Vance, a woman who built a fortress of grief around herself after the man she loved, a Lakota warrior named Chayton, was cut down by cavalry steel. For 6 agonizing months, she lived with his ghost, tending to a love that existed only in memory. She accepted his death, mourned his spirit, and prepared for a life of quiet sorrow. But the frontier is a land of brutal truths, and the cruelest truth of all was waiting for her deep in the Black Hills, not in a shallow grave, but bound to the unforgiving bark of an ancient pine, a spectre of the man she thought she'd lost forever. The year was 1877, and the Black Hills of Dakota Territory bled tension like an open wound. Gold fever had drawn white settlers in a ravenous tide, crashing against the shores of the great Sioux Nation, a land promised to the Lakota by treaties already turning to dust. In the heart of this simmering conflict lived Elara Vance, a woman as untamed as the land itself. She wasn't like the other women in the burgeoning settlement of Redemption Gulch, with their calico dresses and fearful glances. Elara's hands were calloused from taming the soil of her late father's homestead. Her eyes held the far-seeing gaze of someone who understood the language of the clouds, and her heart. Her heart belonged to a man she was forbidden to love. His name was Chayton, which meant falcon in his native tongue. He was a warrior of the Oglala Lakota, his spirit as fierce and free as the bird of his namesake. They had met not in anger or violence, but in a moment of shared humanity. A blizzard had trapped Elara while she was checking her father's old trap lines, and it was Chayton who found her half-frozen and delirious and carried her to the shelter of a hidden cave. In the flickering firelight of those 2 days they spoke. She saw not the savage of the settlers' fearful tales, but a man of deep honor, whose love for his land was a spiritual thing profound and unshakable. He saw not an intruder, but a woman with a spirit that mirrored the resilience of the prairie grass, bending in the wind, but never breaking. Their love was a secret, a fragile thing nurtured in stolen moments. They met in moon-dappled clearings, by the quiet rush of the Spearfish Creek, their worlds colliding in a space that belonged only to them. He taught her the Lakota names for the stars, the medicinal properties of wild herbs, and how to read the stories left in the tracks of animals. She taught him to read the English words in a worn copy of Shakespeare her mother had carried across the plains, and shared stories of a world beyond the jagged peaks of the Black Hills. But their sanctuary was an island in a sea of hate. In Redemption Gulch, the name Chayton was spoken with a mixture of fear and contempt. He was a leader in the resistance against the relentless encroachment of prospectors and ranchers. To the settlers he was a ghost, a phantom who led raids that disrupted supply lines and drove off gold seekers who strayed too far from the established claims. They never saw the man Elara knew, the one who spoke of balance, who grieved for the buffalo herds being slaughtered for sport, and who fought not for conquest, but for survival. The most venomous whispers came from Silas Blackwood. Blackwood was the undisputed king of Redemption, Gulch, a cattle baron whose ranch sprawled across thousands of acres, much of it nibbling at the edges of treaty land. He was a man carved from granite, and greed with eyes as cold and grey as a winter sky. He had made his intentions toward Elara clear since the day she'd buried her father. He saw her homestead not as a legacy of love and sweat, but as a strategic piece of property with a freshwater spring. He coveted. He saw Elara herself as another acquisition, a beautiful, spirited woman who would look good on his arm and cement his status as the town's patriarch. "A woman alone has no place out here, Elara," he'd said to her one afternoon, his large frame blocking the sun in the doorway of her small cabin. "This land requires a firm hand, my hand. Marry me, and you'll want for nothing." Elara's refusal had been polite, but firm. "My father's hand was firm enough to build this place, Mr. Blackwood. I find my own is sufficient to maintain it." His smile was a thin, predatory line. It did not reach his eyes. "Pride is a poor blanket against the cold little bird, and this land is getting colder." His veiled threats were a constant, chilling reminder of the precariousness of her position. It was his men who often rode patrol near the treaty lines, and his voice that was loudest in the saloon, calling for the extermination of the Lakota. He represented everything Chayton fought against: the insatiable hunger of the white man, the belief that everything land-water, even people, could be owned. The last time Elara saw Chayton, the autumn air was crisp with the promise of the coming frost. They met in a grove of aspens, their golden leaves trembling like 1,000 tiny suns. He was quieter than usual, his handsome face etched with worry. "The Bluecoats ride from Fort Meade," he told her, his voice a low rumble. "They say we broke the treaty by attacking prospectors on the North Fork." "But those men were on your sacred land," Elara protested. "They were warned. Their warnings are written in water." Chayton said, his hand gently tracing the line of her jaw. "Ours are carved in stone. They do not see the difference." He spoke of a council meeting of the hot-headed younger warriors who called for an all-out war, and of the elders who feared it would mean their end. He was caught in the middle, a voice of strategic defiance in a chorus of rage. "Be careful," she whispered, her heart a cold knot of dread. "Silas Blackwood has been stirring up the men in town. He offered a bounty for any warrior's scalp." Chayton's eyes hardened. "Blackwood is a man with a hollow spirit. He fills it with the land of others. We know him." He pulled a small, intricately beaded pouch from around his neck. "This is for you, to keep you safe. The symbol is of the falcon, so my spirit will always watch over you." She clutched the pouch, the smooth leather, a small comfort against her palm. Their farewell was desperate, and hurried, a single passionate kiss that tasted of pine and sorrow. He melted back into the trees, becoming one with the shadows, and Elara was left alone with the trembling leaves and the weight of a terrible premonition. 2 weeks later, the news arrived. It came carried on the sweat-soaked horse of Jebediah Smith, a grizzled old trapper who rode between the fort and the town. He stumbled into the Redemption Gulch saloon, calling for whiskey, his face pale beneath its leathery tan. A cavalry patrol, he gasped, had been ambushed by a war party, led by the infamous Chayton. A fierce skirmish had erupted near Shadow Creek. The whole town gathered, as Jebediah, fueled by liquor and self-importance, told his tale. Silas Blackwood stood at the front of the crowd, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. "They fought like demons," Jebediah rasped, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "But our boys were ready. I was scouting a ridge nearby, saw the whole thing. Arrows flying like hornets, gun smoke so thick you could chew it." Elara stood at the edge of the crowd, invisible, her blood turning to ice. "Did they get him?" Blackwood's voice cut through the murmurs. "Did they get Chayton?" Jebediah nodded slowly, his eyes finding Elara's in the crowd for a fleeting, pitying moment before looking away. "I saw it, clear as day. A corporal, a young fella, got him square. He went down on the banks of the creek, went down hard. The warriors who were left grabbed his body and fled back into the hills before the soldiers could claim it. But he's gone, I saw it. Chayton is dead." The word hit Ilara with the force of a physical blow. Dead. The world tilted the jubilant shouts of some of the townsfolk and Blackwood's smug pronouncement of "a great day for progress" fading into a deafening roar in her ears. She turned and fled, stumbling away from the town, away from the faces and the voices, her hand clutching the small beaded pouch at her neck. The falcon spirit meant to watch over her felt like a cold, dead weight against her heart. The long, brutal winter of her grief had just begun. The snows came early that year, a thick, merciless blanket that entombed the Black Hills in a world of white and grey. For Ilara, the landscape was a perfect mirror of her soul. The vibrant colours of her life with Chaitan, the gold of the autumn, aspens, the deep blue of his stoic eyes, the fiery red of the sunset, over the plains had all been bleached away, leaving only the stark monochrome of loss. Her cabin, once a sanctuary of warmth and independence, became a prison of memories. Every object was a fresh torment. The worn copy of Shakespeare held the ghost of his finger, tracing the strange angular letters. The hearth where they had shared hushed conversations on cold nights radiated a chilling emptiness. She would sit for hours staring into the flames, her father's old rifle across her lap, seeing Chaitan's face in the shifting embers, hearing his voice in the mournful howl of the wind. The beaded pouch he had given her never left her side. She would hold it in her hands for hours, the tiny beads a catechism of her sorrow. The falcon. She imagined his spirit soaring free, high above the snow-choked pines, and the image brought her a pain so profound it was almost sweet. It was all she had left. The townsfolk of Redemption Gulch mostly left her to her mourning. They saw her as the grieving daughter of a respected homesteader, a solitary figure now doubly tragic. They didn't know the true source of her sorrow, and she was grateful for their ignorance. Their pity would have felt like poison. Only Silas Blackwood refused to respect her isolation. He began to visit her homestead under the guise of neighborly concern, his imposing figure always arriving on a powerful black stallion that seemed an extension of his own arrogant strength. "It's not right for you to be out here alone, Ilara," he said one afternoon, his breath misting in the frigid air as he stood on her porch, refusing to be turned away. "A wolf took one of my calves just last night, not 2 miles from here. This is a hard land for a lone woman." "I have my father's rifle and a steady hand, Mr. Blackwood," she replied, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. "The wolves in these parts have learned to keep their distance." The double meaning was lost on him, or perhaps he chose to ignore it. Grief is a heavy coat, but it won't keep you warm forever. He pressed his eyes roaming over her cabin, as if already measuring it for new curtains. "It's been 3 months. Life must go on. I am a patient man, Ilara, but my offer still stands. Your land, combined with mine. We could build an empire." "I am not interested in empires," she said, her hand tightening on the doorknob. "I am only interested in being left alone." His smile was thin and humorless. "As you wish. For now." His visits became a cruel ritual, a periodic intrusion that scraped raw the wound of her loss. He would speak of the future of his plans for expansion of the Indian problem being solved now that their most defiant leader was gone. Each word was a shovel of dirt on Chaitan's grave, and Ilara felt herself being buried alive alongside him. To survive, she fell into a brutal routine. Chop wood until her arms ached, and her mind was numb. Hunt for what little game had not yet hunkered down for the winter, the sharp crack of her rifle, a satisfying violation of the oppressive silence. Read her father's books until the words blurred on the page. She spoke to no one, saw no one, she didn't have to, and felt the tendrils of a permanent, crushing loneliness begin to take root. She often found her gaze drifting toward the distant, snow-capped peaks of the Black Hills. Paha Sapa, the heart of everything, the place Chaitan had called the center of the world. His people had taken his body there, she imagined, to lay him to rest in a sacred place, high on a scaffold, where his spirit could journey to the stars unburdened. The thought was her only solace. She would picture the ceremony, the mournful songs of his people, the stoic grief on the faces of his family. It was a complete story, a tragic but finished chapter. Jebediah Smith's eyewitness account was the rock upon which she had built her church of mourning. It was undeniable. It was final. One day, driven by a need to replenish her dwindling supplies of salt and flour, she forced herself to ride into Redemption Gulch. The town was grim, the street a morass of frozen mud and slush. As she tethered her horse outside the general store, she saw Jebediah Smith stumbling out of the saloon, his face flushed with cheap whiskey. He saw her and flinched, his eyes darting away, as if she were the sun itself. He made to cross the street to avoid her, but a sudden impulse seized Elara. She needed to hear it one more time. She needed the finality of his words to cauterize the wound that refused to close. "Mr. Smith," she called out, her voice hoarse from disuse. He stopped, his shoulders hunched. He turned slowly, pulling his hat down low. "Ma'am, I wanted to thank you," she said the words, feeling like ash in her mouth, "for your honesty about what happened at Shadow Creek. Knowing for certain, it is a small mercy." Jebediah shuffled his feet, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere over her shoulder. He reeked of stale liquor and something else, something sour like fear. "Weren't nothing, ma'am. Just told what I saw. A man's duty to tell the truth. You saw him fall with your own eyes." She pressed, desperate for the reassurance of the awful truth. There was no mistake. He finally met her eyes, and what she saw there was not the simple pity of a stranger, but a deep, swimming guilt. It was a flicker, a momentary lapse in his boozy composure, but it was there. He swallowed hard. "No mistake," he said, but the words were too quick, too forceful. He tipped his hat. "Begging your pardon, ma'am. I've got business." He practically fled, scurrying down the alleyway beside the saloon, leaving Elara standing alone in the cold. She stood frozen for a long moment, the encounter replaying in her mind. It was nothing, she told herself. Just a drunk old man, uncomfortable in the presence of a grieving woman. But she couldn't shake the image of his eyes. The guilt. Why would a simple witness feel guilt that night as a new storm raged outside? Elara was visited by a dream. She was standing on the banks of a creek, but the water ran black. On the far side, Chaitan stood, not in his warrior's attire, but as he was that first day in the cave, his face gentle. He didn't speak, but simply raised a hand and pointed. Not up toward the sky, where his spirit should be, but deep into the woods behind him. He looked at her with an expression of profound, aching sorrow, not for his own death, but for her. She woke with a gasp, her heart hammering against her ribs. The wind shrieked through the eaves, sounding like a name being called. His name. The dream, coupled with the memory of Jebediah's guilty eyes, planted a seed. A tiny, impossible seed of doubt in the barren soil of her grief. It was madness. It was the desperate fantasy of a broken heart. But as the winter dragged on, that seed began to sprout a stubborn green shoot, pushing its way through the frozen ground of certainty. She had mourned the story everyone had told her, but what if they had told her a lie? The grip of winter began to loosen its hold on the territory. The sun lingered longer each day, and the snowpack began to recede, exposing the bruised and battered earth beneath. With the melt came a stirring in Ilara's spirit, a restlessness that mirrored the land's slow awakening. The seed of doubt planted by Jebediah's strange behavior and her vivid dream had grown into a thorny, insistent vine that wrapped around her heart. She began to question everything. Why had the Lakota, in the middle of a retreat, burdened themselves with a fallen warrior's body? It was their custom to honor the dead. Yes, but Chaitan had always told her that survival, the preservation of the living, took precedence in the heat of battle. And why had no one else seen it? Jebediah was the sole witness. A drunkard whose loyalty could be bought for a bottle, a fact everyone in Redemption Gulch knew. Her grief, once a smothering fog, began to crystallize into a sharp, cold anger. An anger at Silas Blackwood for his relentless pressure, at Jebediah for his shifty eyes, and at herself for so readily accepting a story that had come from the mouths of her lover's enemies. The turning point came on a day when a Chinook wind swept through the hills, a warm, false spring that melted the snow in torrents. Ilara decided to ride out to push the boundaries of her self-imposed exile. She rode not towards town, but towards the hills, towards the treaty line that was the source of so much bloodshed. She needed to feel the wildness of the land that had been his. As she navigated a narrow game trail through a thick stand of lodgepole pines, she heard a sound, the snap of a twig. Her hand went instantly to the rifle in its scabbard. She dismounted, moving with a fluid silence Chaitan had taught her. Peering through the dense foliage, she saw a figure huddled by the base of a large rock outcropping. It was a woman cloaked in a trade blanket, her back to Ilara. She was Lakota. Ilara's heart seized. She could ride away unseen and avoid a potentially dangerous encounter. But something held her fast. The woman's shoulders were shaking with what looked like silent sobs. Slowly, carefully, Ilara stepped out from the trees, her hands raised in a gesture of peace. "I mean you no harm," she said, her voice clear and steady. The woman spun around, her eyes wide with alarm and grief. On her face, she bore the traditional marks of a mourner. Her hair was cut short, and there were faint, healing cuts on her arms. Ilara recognized her instantly. She had seen her once from a distance with Chaitan. It was his sister Kimmy. Kimmy's alarm quickly hardened into suspicion. "You are the white woman," she said, her voice laced with an old bitterness. "The one who filled my brother's head with foolish dreams." The words were a blow, but Ilara held her ground. "I loved your brother," she said simply. "I am mourning him just as you are." Kimmy let out a short, harsh laugh that held no humor. "You mourn the story the white men tell, a story of a warrior's death in battle, a good death. You do not mourn the truth." Ilara's breath caught in her throat. "What truth? What are you talking about?" Kimmy's eyes, so like Chaitan's, bored into her. She seemed to be wrestling with a great internal conflict, her gaze darting from Ilara's face to the distant mountains and back again. "Our elders forbid us from speaking to your kind. They say you are the source of this poison. But my brother, he trusted you. He said your spirit was not twisted like the others." "Kimmy, please," Ilara begged, taking a step forward. "If you know something, you have to tell me. The story I was told, I am beginning to believe it is a lie." Kimmy studied her for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "A lie is a small word for what has been done," she said finally, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "There was a fight at Shadow Creek, yes, but my brother was not there. He was riding to a secret council with the Cheyenne. He rode alone." Ilara felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "Alone. But Jebediah Smith said he saw him leading a war party. He saw him fall. "The man you speak of has a forked tongue, like the snake," Kimmy said with venomous certainty. "He was paid to tell that story, paid with whiskey and coin by the one you call Blackwood." The name hung in the air between them, a tangible evil. It all clicked into place: Blackwood's desire for her land, his hatred of Chayton, his need to remove his rival in love and in war. But if Chayton wasn't at Shadow Creek, where was he? What was the truth Kimmy spoke of? Then what happened to him? Ilara whispered, her mind reeling. "If he didn't die in battle, your people, are you not mourning him?" Kimmy's face contorted with a fresh wave of pain. "We mourn. But we do not mourn his death. We mourn his loss. He vanished 3 days after the battle at Shadow Creek was supposed to have happened. His horse was found, its leg broken near the old Trapper's Pass. Of my brother there was no sign, no tracks, no blood. Nothing. It is as if the spirits took him." She looked away towards the sacred mountains. But it was not spirits. It was men. "We believe he was taken alive." Alive. The word was a thunderclap in the silent forest. Alive. It was a possibility so immense, so terrifyingly hopeful, that Ilara could barely process it. For 6 months she had grieved a dead hero. The reality that he might be a captive, suffering somewhere or worse, was a new and infinitely sharper kind of agony. "Why?" Ilara asked, her voice trembling. "Why would Blackwood want him alive? A dead warrior becomes a martyr." Kimmy said, her voice filled with a wisdom born of generations of struggle. His story inspires other young men to fight. But a warrior who disappears, that creates fear, confusion. It is a poison that seeps into the heart of the people. It makes them believe their leaders can be plucked from the world without a trace. It is a crueler weapon than a bullet. Kimmy then reached into a fold of her blanket and pulled out a single broken arrow. The fletching was made from the feathers of a red-tailed hawk, a design unique to the white settlers. The tip, however, was what made Ilara's blood run cold. It was obsidian flaked in a precise, masterful way that she had only ever seen one man achieve. "We found this near where his horse fell," Kimmy said, pressing it into Ilara's hand. "The shaft is from your world. The head is from his. It tells a story of a fight, a struggle. It is the last piece of him we have found." Ilara stared at the broken arrow. It was a contradiction, a piece of 2 worlds violently joined and then shattered. It was a clue, a starting point. "His spirit is not at rest," Kimmy said, her eyes locking with Ilara's. "I feel it. He is trapped somewhere between your world and mine. The elders say we must let him go, that to search for him is to invite war with the whites. They are afraid. But I am his sister. And you? You say you loved him." The challenge in her voice was unmistakable. In that moment, the last vestiges of Ilara's grief-stricken passivity burned away, replaced by a white, hot flame of purpose. Chayton was not a memory to be cherished. He was a man alive who needed her. The story of his death had been a carefully constructed lie, and she was the only one who could unravel it. "Show me," Ilara said, her voice ringing with newfound resolve. "Show me where you found his horse. Show me where you found this arrow." The whisper on the wind had become a call to arms, and for the first time in 6 months, Ilara Vance was ready to fight. Following Kimmy's directions, Ilara rode to the old Trapper's Pass, a treacherous and little-used route that cut through a spine of granite hills. It was a place where the shadows clung long and deep, even at midday. The snow had melted in patches, revealing a winter's worth of fallen pine needles and damp earth. It was here Kimmy had said that Chayton's trail had gone cold. Ilara was not a tracker on par with the Lakota, but Chaitan had taught her much. He had taught her to see the land not as a single entity, but as a book filled with countless tiny stories. A bent twig, a disturbed patch of moss, a scuff mark on a stone, each was a word, a sentence. Now she had to read the story of his disappearance. She dismounted and began her search at the spot where Kimmy had said the horse was found. The signs were old, faded by months of snow and melt, but they were there. The disturbed earth where the animal had fallen, the deep gouges in a nearby aspen where it had thrashed in pain. This part of Kimmy's story was true. From there she began to move in ever-widening circles, her eyes scanning the ground with an intensity that bordered on prayer. For hours she found nothing but the tracks of deer and coyotes. Frustration gnawed at her. The trail was 6 months old. It was a fool's errand. She was about to give up as the sun began to dip below the ridge, casting the pass in a deep purple gloom when she saw it. It was almost nothing, a glint of color against the dark, damp soil half hidden under the lip of a rock. She knelt, her heart pounding, and carefully brushed away the dirt. It was a single tiny blue bead, identical to the ones on the pouch Chaitan had given her. It must have been torn from his clothing or a medicine bag during a struggle. It was the first real clue, the first tangible piece of him, since the broken arrow. It proved he had been here on this very spot. She looked around, her perspective shifting. This wasn't just where his horse fell. This was where he had fought. With renewed determination, she examined the area around the rock. And then she saw the other signs a casual observer would miss. On the rough bark of a pine tree about shoulder height was a long, shallow scrape, as if a body had been slammed against it. A few feet away, a patch of moss was torn, not by an animal's hoof, but scraped away as if by the heel of a boot dragging against the ground. She began to piece together a narrative. Chaitan was ambushed. They disabled his horse, first a cruel and effective tactic. He fought back. The broken arrowhead was his, the shaft, the attackers. He was overwhelmed likely by several men. The bead, the scrape on the tree, the torn moss. It was the story of a man being subdued and dragged away. Dragged where she scanned the surrounding terrain. There was only one logical direction away from Lakota territory, and back towards the white settlements, back towards Redemption Gulch, back towards Silas Blackwood. The next day she rode to Shadow Creek, the supposed site of the battle where Chaitan had died. The area was just as Jebediah had described it, a shallow creek bed littered with rocks and flanked by cottonwoods. She spent hours combing the banks. She found what she expected: old shell casings from cavalry carbines, and a few rusted common arrowheads. It was clear a fight had happened here, but there was no sign, not a single trace, that Chaitan had ever been present. She knew his tracks, the unique way he made his arrowheads, the specific herbs he carried in his medicine pouch. There was nothing of him here. Jebediah's story was not just a lie, it was a fabrication, built on the foundation of a real but separate event. Her conviction solidified into a cold, hard certainty. Blackwood had orchestrated this. He had used the cavalry skirmish as a cover story. He had paid Jebediah to be his eyewitness, and he had sent his own men to abduct Chaitan. The question still remained: why? Why keep him alive? Kimmy's theory that a disappearance spread more fear than a death was plausible, but it felt incomplete. Silas Blackwood was not a man of subtle psychological warfare. He was a brute, a man of direct, violent solutions. Keeping a formidable enemy like Chaitan alive, even as a prisoner, was an enormous risk. There had to be another reason. Her investigation had hit a wall. She had a theory and a few scant pieces of evidence, but no clear path forward. She needed to get closer to Blackwood to understand his movements around the time Chayton vanished. Her opportunity came in the form of Deputy Miller. He was a young man, barely 20, with earnest blue eyes, and a chin that was still deciding whether or not to grow a proper beard. Unlike the cynical and compromised Sheriff Brody, who was practically in Blackwood's pocket, Miller still possessed a belief in the law as something more than the will of the most powerful man in town. Elara had noticed him, watching her with a sort of sympathetic curiosity on her rare trips into Redemption Gulch. She found him at the livery checking the shoe on his horse. "Deputy," she said, her tone even and calm. He straightened up, surprised. "Miss Vance, good to see you. Can I help you with something?" "I was hoping you might," she said, choosing her words with care. "My father, before he passed, had some dealings with Mr. Blackwood concerning grazing rights. A dispute. I'm trying to find the paperwork, and I was hoping to pin down the exact date of their last meeting. I believe it was last fall, around the time of that skirmish at Shadow Creek. It was a thin pretext, but it was believable." Miller frowned in concentration. "I remember that time well. The whole town was on edge. Sheriff Brody had us all riding patrols." "Were you out on patrol that week with Mr. Blackwood's men?" she asked, feigning casual curiosity. "Not directly with them," Miller said, shaking his head. "The sheriff keeps us separate from hired ranch hands. But Blackwood and a few of his foremen, they were out for days. Said they were hunting a pack of wolves that had been harassing their herds. Took them deep into the hills towards the old pass. Strange thing was, when they came back, they were empty-handed. Didn't bring back a single pelt." He shrugged. "Guess the wolves outsmarted them." The old trapper's pass. Elara's blood ran cold. "And Jebediah Smith?" she asked. "Was he with them?" "Jebediah." Miller chuckled. "No, he was in town, soaking in the saloon for 3 days straight. Then all of a sudden he rides out one morning and comes back that evening with the story about seeing Chayton die. Bought drinks for the whole saloon that night. Seemed to come into some money." It was all there. The pieces clicked together with sickening precision. Blackwood and his men weren't hunting wolves. They were hunting Chayton. They ambushed him at the pass, abducted him, and brought him back. And Jebediah wasn't a witness. He was an alibi, a paid liar who stayed in town to establish his presence before riding out to a location he'd been told to go to, returning with a story he'd been paid to tell. But where had they taken him? Blackwood wouldn't have brought him back to his ranch. It was too risky. He would need a place that was isolated, hidden, a place no one would ever think to look. Elara thought of the vast, sprawling Blackwood property. It stretched for miles, encompassing rolling plains, deep canyons, and thick forests. But there was one area, a section of rugged timbered land on the far northern edge of his claim, that he had acquired only a year ago. It was considered worthless for grazing, too rocky, too steep. The previous owner, a failed prospector, had built a small, isolated line shack there before he died. Blackwood had bought the land for pennies on the acre. No one ever went there. It was the perfect hiding place. She now had a destination, a terrible, horrifyingly plausible destination. The trail of deceit which had begun with a whisper of doubt had led her to the threshold of a truth she wasn't sure she was prepared to face. She had to go. She had to know. That night, under the cover of a moonless sky, Elara packed a bedroll extra ammunition and what little food she had. She strapped her rifle to her saddle and slipped the knife Chayton had given her into her boot. She was no longer a grieving woman. She was a hunter, and her prey was the truth. The northern edge of Silas Blackwood's property was a different world from the manicured grazing lands near his ranch house. Here the earth buckled and broke into jagged hills cloaked in a dense primeval forest of ponderosa pine and black spruce. The air grew colder, the silence deeper, broken only by the sighing of the wind through the high branches. It was a forgotten corner of the world, a place designed for secrets. Ilara tethered her horse in a secluded ravine, a mile from where she estimated the old prospector's shack to be. The final approach had to be made on foot in silence. Every snap of a twig under her boot sounded like a gunshot in the profound quiet. She moved with the predatory grace Chaitin had taught her, her senses stretched to their breaking point, tasting the air, watching the flight of birds, listening for any sound that was out of place. After nearly an hour of careful ascent, she smelled it. Faint but unmistakable, the acrid scent of a cold campfire. Hope and terror warred within her, making her heart hammer against her ribs. She slowed her pace to a crawl, using the thick undergrowth for cover, until she reached a ridge overlooking a small sheltered clearing. Below her lay the line shack. It was a miserable-looking structure, little more than a pile of rotting logs with a sagging roof. A thin, lazy wisp of smoke curled from its mud-and-stick chimney, confirming her suspicions. Someone was here, or had been recently. But it wasn't the shack that held her attention. It was the tree. In the center of the clearing stood a colossal ponderosa pine, ancient and gnarled its bark like the scaled hide of some prehistoric beast. And against that tree was a figure. For a moment, Ilara's mind refused to process what her eyes were seeing. The figure was slumped, held upright only by the thick ropes that bound him to the trunk. His head hung low, a curtain of long, matted black hair obscuring his face. He was emaciated, his body little more than a skeleton, draped in rags that might have once been buckskin. Her breath hitched in a sob she quickly stifled. It couldn't be. After all these months, it had to be a ghost, a figment of her desperate imagination. She raised the small spyglass her father had owned, her hands trembling so violently she could barely hold it steady. She focused the lens, the brass cold against her skin. The image sharpened. She saw the proud, high cheekbones now sunken and hollow. She saw the strong line of a jaw now covered in a sparse, ragged beard. She saw the faint, familiar scar above his right eyebrow, a memento from a close encounter with a mountain lion. It was Chaitin. He was alive, but only just. He looked like a man who had been kept at the very edge of existence for 6 long months, given just enough food and water to prevent death, but not enough for life. He was a living scarecrow, a sentinel of suffering left to the mercy of the elements, a wave of rage so pure and hot it nearly blinded her, washed over Ilara. This was Blackwood's design. This was his true cruelty. He hadn't just imprisoned Chaitin. He had displayed him, tied him to a tree in the wilderness like an animal, breaking not just his body, but his spirit, stripping him of his dignity and his connection to the world he loved. He was a warrior, a man whose very essence was freedom and movement, and they had turned him into a statue of despair. She had to get him out. Now. She scanned the clearing looking for guards. There were none in sight. A campfire smoldered near the shack, a pot of what looked like thin gruel sitting beside it. A water bucket stood near Chaitin, just out of his reach, a final exquisite torture. It seemed his captors only came periodically to deliver the barest sustenance before leaving him to his lonely torment again. Deputy Miller had said Blackwood and his men had been gone for days, hunting wolves. They were likely his jailers. The risk was immense. They could return at any moment. But leaving him here for one more minute was unthinkable. Clutching her rifle, she slipped down from the ridge, moving like a wraith from tree to tree until she reached the edge of the clearing. Chayton hadn't moved. She wasn't even sure if he was conscious. "Chayton," she whispered, her voice cracking. His head didn't lift. She darted across the open ground, her knife already in her hand. Up close, his condition was even more horrific. His skin was pale and stretched taut over his bones. His wrists and ankles were raw and bleeding from the coarse ropes. He was breathing, but each breath was a shallow, painful-looking rasp. "Chayton, it's me. It's Ilara." She began to saw at the thick rope that bound his chest to the tree. The hemp was thick and weathered, and her hands shook, making the work agonizingly slow. At the sound of her voice, a flicker of something passed through him. His head lifted a fraction of an inch. His eyes, sunken in their sockets, fluttered open. They were glazed with pain and disorientation, and for a terrifying moment, she saw no recognition in them. Ilara. The name was a dry, rasping whisper, a ghost of a sound. "I'm here!" She sobbed, tears blurring her vision as she hacked at the ropes. "I'm getting you out!" The main rope finally gave way. He slumped forward, his dead weight collapsing against her. He was lighter than she could have ever imagined. She eased him to the ground, his head lolling against her shoulder. She quickly cut the ropes on his wrists and ankles, her fingers tracing the raw, chafed skin. He tried to speak again, his parched lips barely forming the words. "How?" "Hush now," she murmured, pulling her canteen from her belt. "Don't talk, just drink." She poured a small amount of water onto his lips, which he lapped at weakly. She gave him more a little at a time, knowing that too much too soon could harm him. The life began to seep back into his eyes, the fog of his long ordeal beginning to lift, replaced by a dawning, incredulous wonder. He reached up a trembling hand, his fingers brushing her cheek as if to confirm she was real. "I dreamed of you," he rasped. "Every night. You were my only warmth in the cold." Ilara choked back a sob, pressing her cheek against his hand. "They told me you were dead. I mourned you, Chayton. For 6 months I believed you were gone." A flicker of the old fire returned to his eyes, a spark of pure, unadulterated hatred. "Blackwood," he hissed. "He wanted me to die slowly. He wanted the land. And you." Suddenly, a sound cut through the air, the distant whinny of a horse. Ilara's head snapped up. They were coming back. Panic seized her. Chayton could barely stand, let alone run. Her horse was a mile away. They were trapped. "Go," Chayton rasped, trying to push himself away from her. "Leave me. Save yourself." "No," Ilara said, her voice fierce with a protectiveness she didn't know she possessed. "I didn't find you just to lose you again. Never again." She looked around frantically, her mind racing. The shack. It was their only chance. It wasn't much, but it was cover. "Can you walk?" she asked, pulling his arm over her shoulder. He gritted his teeth, a low groan of pain escaping his lips as he put weight on his atrophied legs. "I will." With agonizing slowness, half carrying, half dragging him, Ilara helped him stumble the few yards to the dilapidated shack. They collapsed inside, just as the sound of hoofbeats grew louder, entering the clearing. She peered through a crack in the chinking between the logs. 2 men had dismounted. They were brutish, hard-faced men she recognized as foremen from Blackwood's ranch. One of them was a burly man named Cole. Cole walked toward the tree, carrying a bucket of the thin gruel. He stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes going wide as he saw the cut ropes lying on the ground. "He's gone!" he yelled, dropping the bucket. "The son of a bitch is gone!" The other man drew his pistol, his eyes darting around the clearing, scanning the tree line. How he couldn't even stand, someone had to help him. Cole's eyes narrowed, his gaze slowly sweeping the area. It settled on the line shack. He saw the faint scuff marks in the dirt leading to the door marks Ilara had been too rushed to hide. He pointed his rifle directly at the shack. "Come on out!" he bellowed. "Come out now, or we burn this place to the ground with you in it." Inside the dark, musty shack, Ilara leveled her rifle, her heart pounding, a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Chayton lay on the floor beside her, too weak to fight, but his hand rested on the hilt of her knife. They were cornered. The reunion she had dreamed of had, in a matter of minutes, become a desperate siege. The stale air in the shack was thick with tension. Outside, Cole and his partner circled their voices, a low, menacing murmur. Ilara held her rifle steady, sighting them through a crack in the log wall. Beside her, Chayton had pulled himself into a sitting position, the knife held in a white-knuckled grip. "This is my fight," he rasped, frustrated by his own weakness. "Your fight is my fight," she replied, her eyes never leaving their target. "Now tell me everything." As the men outside debated, Chayton revealed the monstrous truth. His ambush and 6-month torment were calculated moves in a much larger game. "Blackwood knows about a secret railroad survey," he explained, his voice low and intense. "The route cuts through the heart of our best hunting grounds. He needs the land, and for that, he needs my people gone." His disappearance was the spark designed to ignite a war. Blackwood planned to let tensions build to push the young Lakota warriors into retaliatory raids. Chayton's eventual, discovered body, mutilated to look like the work of prospectors, would be the final catalyst, the unforgivable outrage that would drive his people into a war they couldn't possibly win. The U.S. Army would finish the job clearing the territory for Blackwood and the railroad. A bullet splintered the doorframe, showering them with wood. The time for talk was over. "Deputy Miller," Ilara whispered urgently. "He suspected something was wrong. If I can bring him here, he'll see the truth." "You must go," Chayton agreed, his mind sharp and tactical. "I will create a diversion. Leave me your rifle. Go out the back window. When you are clear of the clearing, I will fire. It will draw their full attention and buy you time." Leaving him felt like tearing a part of herself away, but she knew it was their only chance. Her hands trembling, she handed him her rifle and the extra ammunition. Their fingers brushed in a silent promise of return. She slipped to the rear of the shack, easing her way through a small, hide-covered window and landing softly on the damp earth. Keeping low, she scuttled into the underbrush, not daring to breathe until she had put 100 yards between herself and the cabin. She paused behind a thicket of firs, looking back. A single defiant gunshot cracked through the forest. Immediately, Cole and his partner scrambled for cover, returning fire at the shack. They were completely focused, their backs to the forest where she hid. It was the opening she needed. Ilara turned and ran. She ran as she had never run before, fueled by adrenaline and a desperate, all-consuming love racing toward her horse and the slim hope of justice that lay in Redemption Gulch. Ilara rode like a woman, possessed the 20 miles to Redemption Gulch, a blur of thundering hooves and desperate prayer. She didn't slow at the town limits, galloping down the main street just as dawn broke. She threw herself from her exhausted horse and burst into the sheriff's office, a wild figure before a startled Deputy Miller. "Chayton's alive!" She gasped, her breath catching in painful sobs. "Silas Blackwood has him. He's held him for 6 months at the old line shack on his north property. Jebediah lied. It was all a plot to start a war." The words tumbled out a frantic torrent of truth, seeing the raw terror and fierce conviction in her eyes, and recalling his own suspicions about Blackwood's wolf hunt. Miller didn't hesitate. He grabbed a shotgun from the wall rack. "I believe you," he said, his voice firm. "Let's ride." As they emerged onto the street, Silas Blackwood himself rode toward them, his imposing figure cutting through the morning mist. His eyes narrowed, taking in their grim faces and the shotgun in Miller's hands. "Trouble, deputy?" he asked, his voice dangerously smooth. Before Miller could answer, another rider galloped furiously into town. Blackwood's other foreman, his face a mask of panic. He reined his horse in sharply. "Sir, it's Cole!" he yelled, oblivious to the audience. "The prisoner! He had a rifle. He shot Cole, killed him. He's still holed up in the shack." The foreman's panicked words echoed in the stunned silence of the street. "Prisoner." The public confession sealed Blackwood's fate. The cattle baron's composure shattered, replaced by a snarl of pure fury. His eyes fixed on Ilara, full of venomous hatred. "You!" he roared. He drew his revolver, but his rage made him clumsy. Miller reacted instantly, tackling Blackwood and sending them both tumbling into the muddy street. The townsfolk, drawn by the commotion, saw it all: the most powerful man in the territory, exposed as a kidnapper and a liar. When the bewildered Sheriff Brody finally appeared, Miller had his shotgun leveled at the disgraced Blackwood. "He's under arrest, Sheriff," Miller declared, his voice ringing with newfound authority, "for kidnapping, conspiracy, and murder." Ilara didn't stay to watch them haul Blackwood away. She mounted her horse and rode Miller and a hastily formed posse following close behind. Her heart flew ahead of them, back to the small cabin in the pines. They found Chayton inside the rifle, resting beside him, his gaze fixed on the door. He was weak, exhausted, but when he saw Ilara step through the doorway, a slow, brilliant smile spread across his face. She rushed to his side and knelt, taking his hand. The ordeal was over. Outside, the sun had risen, fully bathing the Black Hills in a warm, golden light. Their future was uncertain, but in the quiet of the cabin, they had found their new beginning. The story of Ilara and Chayton became a legend in the Black Hills, a testament to a love that refused to be buried, and a truth that fought its way into the light. Silas Blackwood's plot unraveled his empire of deceit, crumbling into the Dakota dust, proving that even in the lawless heart of the West, the most powerful lies can be undone by one person's unwavering courage. Their journey was far from over, a long road of healing and rebuilding stretching before them, but they faced it together, their bond forged not in whispers, but in the fires of a shared survival. The frontier was a place of brutal endings, but for them it was also a place of impossible new beginnings. If this story of resilience, love, and justice on the American frontier captured your imagination, please help us keep these tales alive. Hit that like button to show your support. Share this video with fellow history and drama lovers, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more true-life stories from the Wild West. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss a new chapter from the past. Thank you for listening.